Now, we've got a very important 3/4 of an hour with the Minister. First of all, thank you very much for attending this morning. We all know Matthew Pennycook, who is the Minister of State at MHCLG, barely 18 months into the job. But this is a man who took, I think we would all agree, quite a lot of time and trouble pre the election to learn his trade, as it were. And for that, we are all very grateful. So I'm not going to say anything more other than just to remind you that we are in the room until 11:15. Then we have a coffee break for half an hour, and I'll be rounding you up to come back for some fast and furious presentations from the team. This session is going to take, in character, is going to be a question and answer session. And so in a way it's going to be rather like the show, with this time the headline guests being interviewed first. So will you please just bear with the team whilst they ask the questions. We're going to swap places, Matthew, and I'm going to sit down. Over to you. Yes, you are.
Like being put on the spot, isn't it?
No. This is a very friendly audience. No, we are all rowing in the same boat, in the same direction. Indeed.
So Matthew, thank you very much for joining us. We're very grateful to you, just sweeping you in and sweeping you out very quickly with your other commitments. But thank you very much indeed. As Mary says, this is a friendly audience, undoubtedly. I want to start with the first question is that going into the last general election, you took the brave decision to support housing in the Green Belt, what has now become the Grey Belt. Why were you so certain that such a dramatic policy change was needed?
That's a good question. And let me, I suppose, take it in two parts and sort of set out what we're trying to do on brownfield, which I think is the other side of the coin. Everyone in the room will know when we revised the NPPF in December last year, we broadened the definition of brownfield land. We set a strengthened expectation that applications on brownfield land should be approved, and we made clear that plans should promote the densification of urban areas. Then we followed that with a working paper in September of last year on a brownfield passport, again looking at what more we can do to further prioritise, fast-track the development of previously developed land. We're taking forward a lot of those ideas and the feedback received from that in the new suite of national policies for decision-making, which we're currently working up as part of a revised NPPF. Which you won't have to wait long for the consultation on. I know you're waiting with bated breath on that. And then we're doing much more to utilise brownfield land. We got from the spending review circa £5 billion for new land and infrastructure funding. But with all that in place, and with our absolute determination to better utilise brownfield land, it is a fact, it's a truism, there isn't enough brownfield land on land registers across the country to produce the volume of homes that we need each year, let alone that are in the right locations and that are viable. So we had to very clearly look at what more we can do with the Green Belt. Now, I say this to my political opponents in the chamber, but it's not like that before the 12th of December last year, we had no Green Belt release. We had haphazard Green Belt release that was not planned in the way that we think it should be taken forward. So, absolutely, determined to sort of grasp the nettle, bring forward a modernised strategic approach to Greenbelt release through plan making and decision making to get the volume of homes that we need here. And I was told, I said this at a conference last week, and why I do think that politicians, political parties taking a stance and arguing for it can make a real difference. I was told by God knows how many people, don't go near the Greenbelt. It's the third rail of politics, along with council tax and whatever else you might want to throw in there. Don't touch it, you're on a hiding to nothing. I have been quite surprised at how little pushback we have got. I think there is a recognition out there that in many parts of the country, it's entirely right that local authorities are reviewing their green belt, releasing in first order the lower quality parts of that grey belt. So that's why we took that decision. And I think it's the right one. We come forward in terms of touch on whether it's having the intended impact and where it is across the country. But all the evidence that I see suggests it is.
Okay, I mean, that wasn't the only thing, of course. You immediately made clear coming into office you were going to reverse Michael Gove's policies. We associate them with Michael Gove because he was the Secretary of State at the time. He introduced my bête noire, which is a 4-year supply. If you're producing a plan, protection from 5-year land supply for a plan that had been adopted for a 5-year period. And you weren't even able to question the 5-year land supply for that 5-year period. Why was it important to signal these changes so soon to coming into office?
Well, it was so important because whatever way you cut it, that was and it was a coherent package. It wasn't just a series of ad hoc changes to the NPPF, a coherent package that from our point of view was fundamentally anti-supply. And you can look at all of the changes that were made, you know, the emphasis on locally prepared plans that only had to have regard to sufficient housing need, the softening of land supply and housing delivery tests, historical over-delivery being counted, the various local characteristics for which you could argue that you were able to deviate from the standard method. All of that essentially and very consciously and deliberately gave local authorities that wanted to take advantage of that freedom the ability to plan for less housing than is needed, despite that nominal target remaining in place. So we had to undo all that. To ensure that the targets bite. We've obviously taken forward a revised standard method, and the NPPF as a whole, and I think this is acknowledged, included numerous pro-growth measures alongside the reversal of those anti-supply changes. But that's why we had to do it, signalled very clearly in opposition that we were going to do that. And again, I was told we won't be able to do the NPPF in less than a year. We did it in, I think, 5.5 months. And we're cracking on with a further tidying up and revision to introduce these new national policies for decision making, which I think will be really impactful in their own right and will build on what we did last year.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Matthew. Oh, sorry. So I've got 2 questions. That's the way we're running this particular show. My first is in relation to strategic planning. I'm asking for a friend, although she's sitting over there. So in 2020, when we started the show, the then Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, whatever happened to him, set up a working party that drafted a white paper proposing radical change to the UK planning system, basing it on a code-based approach, more like a US-type approach. That cunning plan never progressed, but I'd welcome your thoughts, having been in the job for some time now. Was the white paper onto something in relation to such radical reform, or is the current system fixable, and will a reversion back to strategic planning be the answer?
That's an interesting question. Let me say a couple of things in response to that. First, I think there are good reasons to believe, and I took the view, that the 2020 white paper was flawed in a number of respects. What's a good example? Take our revised standard method, for example. The mutant algorithm, so-called mutant algorithm, I didn't name it that, obviously. It was members of Robert Jenrick's own party that named it that. But the approach that took, vis-a-vis our revised standard method, incredibly complex approach to trying to determine assessed need and how the targets that fed out of that, you know, trying to mix stock with volatile population projections. We took a different view, obviously. Simple stock and affordability, I think, is clearer. So I think there are technical reasons to say that the 2020 white paper was flawed. On the sort of principle of a zonal approach, I made the decision in opposition to the frustration of some who really want to drive us there, that to try and tip up the whole system and go for a big bang zonal change would have had a real chilling effect across this whole Parliament. I think everything would have stopped as we took, it probably would have had to be another white paper, legislation and everything through, and we'd had a hiatus in development that we can't really afford to have. So we judged that essentially you could get the existing system, we think, to work and work much better with a series of targeted changes, and we've been going around, setting around making those changes. But essentially what I want to get to, and it's probably the first time I've said this, but I look at what are the outcomes, this is my starting point, what are the outcomes we want to see? We want to see much, much clearer rules-based national policy. We want to see the avoidance of duplication of national policy in local plans. We want to see an end to, where it's harmful, local standards being at odds with clear national standards. When I look at the system as we have it now, the TCPA system and the proper zonal system that different parts of the world have, I often think of it like a horseshoe. And I think you can get basically to most, if not all, of the outcomes that you're driving at through zonal through a fixed rules-based approach through the TCPA. And that's where we're heading. Layering in, quite rightly, strategic planning, because we've got to ensure the right decisions being made at the right level. But that's the judgment we took in opposition. We think we'll get there in terms of those outcomes, as I say, through the new suite of national policies for decision making. But you'll all be the judge of that, and you can feed into the consultation as soon as we launch it.
Yeah, I'm now going to join the queue to high-five you in the light of that answer. Thank you for that. And it beautifully segues into my next question, which relates to national development management policies. So the decision has been taken to publish NDMPs as a non-statutory document rather than having statutory force, which is a position, frankly, I've long advocated, to the chagrin of some of my professional colleagues. What's motivated that decision to have non-statutory NDMPs? And might we see model planning conditions publicised soon to have consistency in relation to conditions as well as policies?
You'll see very, very soon what we have determined is the best way forward. On the sort of non-statutory, statutory debate, and it's angered, I've seen, quite enjoyed the furious critiques of why we should have gone down the statutory route. Look, I think there are benefits to a statutory approach in theory. I accept those. Although actually and I've had some of the people in this room around a table say, what do you expect that statutory NDMPs could do and would do, and what would they look like? Every single person had a different opinion. And it actually is sort of failing of the last government to not really set out quite clearly how they intended to roll them out. But I accept that there are benefits in theory. I suppose as the decision maker, I had to sit and look at what is the impact of statutory, or what would be the impact of statutory NDMPs on the planning system as a whole? And that's where I do think you run into a series of quite significant legal and operational risks in terms of a chilling impact, particularly on the current system. When you look at some of the debates that would have to be resolved, essentially we're talking about local development plans and statutory NDMPs under that scenario being given equal weight. What does in conflict in that scenario actually mean? Are we going to bog ourselves down, to the advantage of some people in the room, I suppose, for years and years and years, years and years of litigation as to what those sort of debate, those sort of questions mean and how they resolve themselves? So I suppose we made a judgment call. Again, the theoretical benefits were more difficult to realise in practice, and that we could get most of the way there with a non-statutory route. And I think this is the important thing, if the non-statutory route works and it beds in, there's nothing to say that we can't transition to a statutory model at some point in the future. That option remains open to us. But we took, on the balance of risk and reward, we took the decision to go down the non-statutory route. And I think people will see that, again, what we've sought to get to through the introduction of these new national policies for decision making, again, in a sort of, and we're toying with this, it is a revised NPPF, it's a tidied up NPPF, where the distinctions between plan making and decision making are far more clearly drawn out. But I think people will hopefully agree, feed into the consultation obviously, that it does get us, in terms of those outcomes, clarity, the avoidance of duplication, clear national standards that run through the whole system. I think it gets us to where we need to be.
And model conditions?
Model conditions, you'll have to wait and see, I'm afraid. I can't spill the beans on the whole.
Brilliant
politician's
answer. Thank you, Matthew. Hand over to Sasha.
Good morning, Matthew. Could I just ask, sorry, that might be a bit informal, I apologise, I know it is. Can I ask you about local plans and the transitional arrangements? Because one of the frustrations is this rush to get within the deadline and effectively hit lower housing targets and then the new updated standard methodology figures. Could you comment on that? Why LPA is effectively being allowed to meet a lower target?
Well, again, and it sort of runs through everything that Angela, when she was Secretary of State, and now Steve do when we're making decisions. We've got to balance theoretical benefits with a degree of pragmatism, and we took the decision that it was right to let a number, and it's only actually in practice been a fairly small number, but a small number of plans at an advanced stage of plan making through the system. Better to have those in place than to set them right back to the start of the process. And then ensure that the new targets are biting for the rest of the LPAs that didn't come through that March cut-off. What we did to, I suppose, compensate for that, and I think this is where we want to get to in general, we had a couple of discussions last week actually with individual members of Parliament who said to me, we're open to speculative development because we don't have an up-to-date local plan. We don't want local plans to be discrete exercises that happen every 10, 15 years with gaps in between. These should be rolling dynamic documents that are kept up to date. And so therefore to sort of balance out the transitional arrangements and letting some people through the system, we obviously made changes to ensure that the level of ambition is raised sooner rather than later. And in particular where an LPA's adopted plan annual housing requirement is either 80% or less than its annual housing target, they've got to add that 20% buffer and start bringing those plans up to that higher ambition sooner rather than later. And we thought that struck the right balance between letting a few through rather than sending them all the way back, but getting most under the new numbers.
Thank you. And the second thing I wanted to ask you about was the Nature Restoration Fund and the aspiration and aim. What in your judgment underlies why you're promoting that as part of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill?
A bill which is nearly through, I'm glad to say, and has been less rocky than I imagined actually. Overall, it's sailed through. It's been one of the fastest pieces of legislation I think since the Brexit years, and nearly caught up with the Renters' Rights Act. Shows you what a hard time that had. But it's a really important part of that bill, the whole of Part 3. And essentially what we're driving at, it's unfortunately been framed by its detractors on sort of both ends as pitting nature against development. I don't see it like that. We genuinely tried to target a win-win here. And I say that because the current arrangements for discharging environmental obligations not only delay and deter development, and we know they do. I have Green Party MP Ellie Chow's constantly telling me they don't. We know they do. Particularly when it comes to nutrient neutrality and sensitive river catchments, for example. But they not only do that, but they don't have great outcomes for nature. They don't. And so what we've tried to do through the new approach is, not unlike the sort of underlying rationale behind our Greenbelt policy, is you can get much better outcomes if you move to a strategic approach and a strategic level, if you leverage economies of scale, if you reduce the need for those costly project level assessments, we can get much better outcomes for nature, we can deliver planning consents faster, and we can ensure overall the aggregate cost to developers is no more than the status quo. And we would think it will really have real pro-growth but pro-nature impacts in lots of the parts of the country. And we've made very clear we're going to start with nutrient neutrality. It's a very obvious one for EDPs to roll out. A bit of a test and learn approach in there will allow us to move on to other diffuse constraints as well as species where it's applicable, and there are some where it's fairly obvious. I used in the debates the example of great crested newts where local level district licensing schemes, but already take that strategic approach in principle to how we can drive those outcomes. But yes, really important part of the bill, and along with other reforms, the modernisation of planning committees, all the changes we made to the consenting regime for nationally significant infrastructure. We're looking to switch those on in very short order. We've been doing the work on the regulations alongside the passage of the bill.
Thank you very much. Victoria.
Thanks, Sasha. Thank you, Minister. So the next few years and decades are going to see considerable challenges in making sure that much needed development is adequately served by infrastructure. And I'm thinking grid connections, which is something that Jenny mentioned earlier, and also something like water. What is the government doing to make sure that infrastructure is provided in the right place and at the right time in order to deliver the homes that are much needed?
Yeah, and this is, I think, among the sort of most pressing issues for most members of Parliament who come to me, because in many parts of the country that infrastructure is not being delivered early in the development process. In many cases it's an afterthought and delivered not particularly effectively either. There's obviously lots of work going on across government to try and address the root causes of the problem. In water, for example, we haven't had an arrangement where there is sufficient investment in water infrastructure, and certainly in terms of the alignment of the planning system and the water investment cycle, they need to be better aligned. And that is why, and I get this quite a lot, water companies are not statutory consultees, but to the extent that they're meant to input at the strategic level in the development of local plans, something is clearly not working. So there's more that, all of which is to say there's more that other government departments need to do and are doing. When it comes to infrastructure specifically on development, I mean, again, communities rightly expect that it should be delivered as early in the process as possible. Local plans are primarily the mechanism, in our view, for addressing needs and opportunities in relation to infrastructure. It's where infrastructure should be identified, what's required, how is it to come forward. We've got to ensure that more local authorities have an infrastructure funding statement in place. There's a clear duty on them, but not many have. The Chief Planner recently wrote to local authorities to stress the need to have one of those in place. But I suppose this is one of those challenges that doesn't lend itself to a simple answer. Local plans can do some of the work. Government investment in land and infrastructure, grant funding can do some of the work. Strategic plans, I expect to do some of the work in identifying at a very high level above local plans what are the infrastructure requirements and opportunities for sub-regions. We've done other interventions, our golden rules, to try and drive more infrastructure up front out of land release from the Greenbelt. The NPPF strengthened the expectations on modernised infrastructure. So we're doing a lot. There is more to do, I think, to get to the nub of this question, but it's not an easy one to solve, and there's no single silver bullet that will get you there.
Thank you. And then can I come back to the grey belt
Yes.
and ask you, I mean, that the policy is now bedded in quite well. Is it working as you'd hoped?
I think it is working as I hoped, and I suppose it takes us back to Chris's question in a sense, and brownfield and greenbelt. Why did we do that? And it speaks to actually the sort of business model that lots of the house builders, Jenny will know this. Lots of the dynamics around house building are driven by the scarcity of land. And we do just need to, whatever else you do alongside it, release more land into the system. And that was what we very deliberately sought to do through the Greenbelt intervention. And I think it is having an impact. I'll put it to the room whether you're seeing the impact. From what I'm seeing, for example, on the planning portal, TerraQuest data, but also anecdotally the number of schemes coming through, I think it is having an impact. Hopefully we start to see that impact in the statistics much more visibly going forward. But the room can tell me if they don't think it's working. Lots of MPs who don't want to see any grey belt release think it's working quite successfully and tell me so, moaning at me about that fact, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us here. Ding dong, the duty to cooperate is dead, as I've seen it HM-related. Is it intended that spatial development strategies, that tier of planning, replace it, that it does better, and how quickly?
Yeah, I've already got a bit of flack for announcing this last week. And to be fair, I did expect it to divide opinion to an extent. I think if you go back to, let me set out why we sort of took the decision, the rationale for it. Obviously, the duty introduced in 2004 in the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act meant to, act as that bridge for the replacement of regional planning, which was abolished, has not worked particularly effectively. I think by common consensus would be the view of the room, I expect. And does lead you to, when an inspector is examining a plan, often very binary decisions as to whether the duty's been met or not. And we think, in most cases, that inspectors can resolve those issues at examination, rather than having to face that binary duty, which can lead, on occasion, to quite detrimental outcomes in having plans fail. So we have taken the decision to not save the duty as we bring on the new system and bring those regulations into force. So it won't be, it'll be removed for existing plans in the current system at the point that new system is switched on. And we think that's the right decision, not least because you're absolutely right. We are intending to bring forward the spatial development strategies that the Planning Infrastructure Bill gives rise to as quickly as possible next year. So we want that new strategic tier of planning alongside national policy to be doing the work that the duty did, and we still obviously expect local planning authorities to collaborate across boundaries where they need to. But we did judge that trying to drive as many plans as we can to adoption, and I'm absolutely determined to progress very, very rapidly towards that commitment to universal coverage, that the duty as it exists does present, I think, in too many cases that I'm comfortable with, in the way it's framed as that binary legal choice at the moment, a problem to that objective. But we're always happy to hear feedback on that and other issues.
And my second question, also on the theme of local plans, is whether local plans should be doing more to allocate land for renewable and low carbon energy development. I'm not aware of any plan that allocates land in England for that sort of development.
We definitely want to see more renewable deployment, obviously, in line with the government's ambitions. We want to see local plans take better account of that. We did make changes to the NPPF to strengthen this. I think there is, I should say, more that we'll say about that as part of the new suite of national policies for decision making that will be brought forward, as I say, in fairly short order. But no, absolutely, you're right that we do need to see that rolled out in local plans more proactively.
Delighted to hear that, and I'll hand over to Charlie for his questions.
Thanks, Thea. Matthew, as Mary said in her introduction, to your immense credit, you spent a huge amount of time as Shadow Minister preparing for your role as Minister, and a huge amount of effort. Has it played out as you'd foreseen, or are there any particular aspects of the role as Minister as opposed to Shadow Minister that have come as a surprise?
I don't think anything's come as a surprise. Again, sorry, this is the downside of doing lots of conferences in a row, but I said this at LPDF last week. Being in opposition is a very, very different beast to being in government, not least because you are completely, basically it was me and one special advisor who has done a huge amount of work behind the scenes with me on it. But that's essentially all you have in opposition. And if you're scrutinising legislation or that, you're very heavily reliant on yourself. You don't have the civil service. So there are obvious differences. I haven't been surprised by anything that's happened. And I think actually the civil service is often sort of denigrated. It's a sort of Dominic Cummings legacy of, attack the blob. But I've been amazed at how hard-working and professional the civil service is, and the amount that we have managed to get out in... what is it now, 17 months. If you look back at everything, because I was answering a question about why didn't we do the sequential flood risk changes earlier, and there was always going to be people that want to see absolutely reasonable and appropriate interventions made sooner. When you look at everything we've done in that period, there's an absolutely huge amount. We overhauled the NPPF, as I said, in less than 6 months. New Homes Accelerator in place, up and running, we think is unlocking tens of thousands of consented but stalled sites across the country, a new towns task force, a landmark planning and infrastructure bill. We've passed the Renters' Rights Act. We're progressing leasehold reform. We have a very ambitious draft common hold and leasehold reform bill, again published before the end of the year. When you look at all that, we've done a huge amount. There's more to come. But nothing has surprised me in terms of how the system works. As I say, I have been surprised by the lack of opposition to some of our proposals, for example, that different approach to the Green Belt, where actually I expected a bit more kickback than we've got. But I think actually, unless you're sort of opposed in principle to any form of development, most of the sites coming forward, and this pertains to Green Belt in particular, are in sustainable locations. They're in appropriate locations. They're land that really should be being used for development. So again, I think we've got the policy design right that's mitigated some of that. But that would be, I suppose, the only surprise to me, that things we thought and were prepared to take much more of a political hit on have not materialised in quite the way I expected.
Tempted to ask next, do you ever sleep? But,
not a lot.
I'm going to instead ask about what may lie ahead. Now, there are a number of amendments proposed, not just by me, to the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, mostly by me, in relation to which the government, i.e. you, saw the case for legislative change, but felt there wasn't the time to deliver it within the life cycle of the PIB. Hillside being the most discussed example, Day was another that we've discussed, and there are others too. What's the latest thinking on whether there will be a further, if not planning bill, planning-related bill during this Parliament?
Need to be very careful. There's probably a journalist lurking in the room somewhere, in the sense of, let me choose my words very carefully. We obviously always keep legislation under review, and I'm obviously not going to stand up and say there definitely won't be further planning legislation in this Parliament. But on the question of whether we are developing, have in preparation, a second planning bill, we don't. I just frankly think there aren't enough of those types of measures required to make up a whole new piece of legislation. When we were developing the planning infrastructure bill, we obviously did an exhaustive trawl of what are the things we need to get in. It's a pretty large bill as it goes already, and took the decision to deprioritise certain things. Some things we've managed to get through the Commons and Lords process and add into the bill. But I think there is a case for, as we've said, Hillside's a good example. We think, gave you this commitment, Charlotte, so I'm going to negotiate on legislation now, but to enact 73B, and we think that deals with a fair chunk of some of the Hillside issues, not all of them. But there is, I think, a fairly robust case for legislation in some form. But there are many vehicles that might come under and ways to take that forward. But no, as to whether there's a big second planning bill lurking, I'm afraid to disappoint you all, there's not. Not least because we have to do a huge amount of work to enact the planning infrastructure bill that we've just passed, and all the secondary regulations and everything required to switch that bill on. That's a considerable undertaking in itself. You mentioned 73B. Can you give us any clues as to when we might see that on the statute books? Not today. Not today. Not today. Watch this space. But I'll keep you posted.
Thank you. Mary, back to you.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm wondering, first of all, where is Leah Needham? Is she here?
Apologies, this is actually from my colleague Andrea, who couldn't make it. But it was the main question was to do with SME house builders. So I work for a small and medium enterprise house builder. What do you think that? Do you think that the government has done enough to support SMEs in the changes? We're seeing a few small site policies come through, local plans, etc., which is really positive. We think they could do more. Is there any more support that you think you could give to SMEs, because they're such an important part of bringing forward this housing around supply? Sites can often come forward a lot quicker without the sort of large infrastructure that's required. So I see them as a very key element to house building.
Absolutely need to do more for SMEs. I think Jenny and I have been on a panel where we've had this precise conversation. But let me just put the answer to that in the sort of context of the housing system as a whole. The volume house builders do absolutely necessary work in delivering a huge proportion of the homes required. We need them to continue doing that. It's a very risky business, appreciate that. We're trying to reduce development costs in various ways to try and make that an easier proposition. And I think that's recognised. But the system as a whole, we have to diversify and make it more competitive by getting different entrants onto the pitch. And I think that's recognised. I don't think that's seen at odds as what the volume house builders need to do. And that does mean more SMEs back in the game, more councils building homes at scale, other providers, be it community-led housing, different types of rural housing provision. All of this needs to be in the mix. Because if you take it back, I always go back to the 80s where SMEs were delivering nearly 40%, I think, of all the homes in the country. It's now under 10%. And I think that is a problem. You know, every housing downturn that we have, the big players with deep pockets, big land portfolios, they can hang on. The smaller players get squeezed out. We get a more and more homogenous industry. And that does have consequences for the volume of homes we can deliver, the type of homes we can deliver. So yes, we want them back on the pitch in a big way. I think we've done a fair amount already to help them do that. On the three big challenges that SMEs tell us that they face: land, finance, and regulation. On land, we've got a really interesting small sites aggregator pilot trying to pull together small plots of land, which we're hoping to expand. On Homes England are making more land available to SMEs directly. When it comes to finance, allocated a huge amount of money through the Home Building Fund, another 100 million of which I think is going very specifically on SME accelerator loans. And then when it comes to easing the burden of regulation for SMEs, we obviously went out to consult. Again, this will come through the revised NPPF that we'll go out to consultation on very shortly. But a new category of site size threshold, a medium-sized category, deliberately aimed at SMEs and trying to grow those SMEs that have managed to hang on and are doing fairly well, but where the burden of regulation is eased, whether it's on BNG or any other number of regulation, but trying to make that easy. And again, and this will come alongside that MPBF, a new suite of design guidance. And I think there's a real opportunity for SMEs in particular, with clear design templates, codes, alongside a fixed rules-based planning system. SMEs should have a far easier time of coming through the system and building more, but more good quality and attractive homes to boot, in a way that will reduce, and it's always been our aim, where can we reduce reasonable opposition in the system, because people want to see more quality along with more volume.
Yep.
I'm going to ask Jenny if she would like to respond in any way to that exchange, or whether she has a question.
Yeah, happy to comment, and Matthew recollects perfectly. Larger house builders, do not fear competition. And, we welcome SMEs, and actually the issues are the same no matter size. We all need to make a return on equity case to achieve the investment for housing delivery and for growth. We all take risks. There's a scale issue, but the risks are significant. Minister, before you arrived, I talked about the importance of clarity, certainty, and consistency. It doesn't matter whether you're delivering 1 unit a year or 10,000 units a year. The message is still the same. And seeing some sort of preferential policy to support SMEs in and of itself isn't an issue, but we do have to look at why SMEs are finding the environment challenging. And a lot of it has to do with the burden of regulation and the shape of the planning process, rather than necessarily specific underlying sort of policy or site availability issues. We are seeing SMEs leave the sector, not loudly, but quietly winding down their businesses, moving to land promotion, because the pain of delivering housing is now so significant. The risk of delivering housing is so significant, and it doesn't matter if you're delivering 1 or you're delivering 10,000. New regulation, future home standards, BNG, all of those things make it a technically complex process. And again, before you joined us, Minister, I mentioned the CMA housing market study, where it pointed very clearly that it is the complexity of our planning system that has given us the shape of the planning and housing sector that we have. And so fundamental changes to the planning system shouldn't just touch one element. It should effectively reclaim the process in a fluid and frictionless way to achieve the better outcomes. Through my career, I've been very supportive of SMEs, but pitting each other against is not a positive sort of approach. We all need to deliver.
Thank you. Now, I've got another question, if I may. Sorry, Minister, from the audience. Grant. Where is Grant Butterworth?
Thanks, Minister. Yeah, so in Leicestershire and Rutland, we're quite a fan of the duty, actually, ably supported by Mr. Tucker. But we're hopefully going to have pretty much a full suite of local plans in a couple of years' time, subject to PINs being able to support all those examinations. And at that point, we'll hopefully be heading through LGR. So we're really up for spatial development strategies. We're really up for making progress. But there may be a bit of a decision to take in terms of getting local plan review in place versus putting efforts into the spatial development strategy. And if that's going to do the heavy lifting of unmet need and DTC type issues. So I guess the question is, how will you advise authorities to prioritise through your performance management local plan review versus SDS? Because I think we'd appreciate the time to get the SDS right without too much penalty in terms of things like 5-year land supply, housing delivery test, up-to-date local plans.
Brian, I'm happy to either write to you or have officials write to you with lots of the technical detail, but in very broad terms, I don't think it's an either or, can't be an either or. And I'm sorry for what that means in terms of your capacity. But again, maybe there's a slight misunderstanding about what SDSs are in the government's view. We're talking about very high level frameworks for housing growth and infrastructure deployment. These are not big local plans. You shouldn't be pausing local plans to go and charge away and do an SDS. Local plans, where they're not up to date, should be being developed in conformity and alongside with an SDS coming through. There'll be lots more guidance to help you along the way. We've given you a lot of funding already. There's probably more funding to come, no doubt. But it can't be an either or, I'm afraid. And we definitely don't, and are very clear on our messaging here, that local authorities should not pause or slow down work on local plan development just because SDSs are coming through. They do very different things. They've got to be aligned, but they're not doing the same thing. And anyone writing a big local plan for a sub-region will not be doing it right, and we'll have guidance in place to ensure that they don't go down that route.
Grant, I think you have another question. No. Well, there's a question on my list here. So have you considered how the expectations of 5-year housing land supply, the housing delivery test and other local plan performance incentives and controls might be adapted to be applied flexibly to allow a sensible sequencing of plan making in the brave new world?
I'm not even sure I know what that means. Did AI generate that? Did AI? No. It was you. I'm more than happy to write to the Honourable Member, that's what I should say. Yeah. I'm not sure I know what that means. Seriously, it's Grant's question, he can explain it.
I mean, well, I guess I think you've answered most of it, thank you. But there is something about, for new university councils, say we don't have a full suite of up-to-date plans, how will you performance manage that? I mean, things like, we could end up with a unitary with 2/3 up-to-date plan coverage. So how are you going to performance manage that in terms of the new unitary 5-year land supply housing delivery test? That's maybe the second bit of the question.
Yeah. No, and it's a completely reasonable and fair point. There is going to be a period of challenge as we transition with LGR underway, with what we're trying to drive on local plans and SDSs. I don't think we had the sort of luxury of saying we don't have the time to sit back and sequence them in the ideal order and allow one after the other. And I suppose what I'd say to you, Grant, and anyone else in the room who's representing a local planning authority is where we can provide more central support. As I say, we're already providing quite a fair amount of funding. I think 14 million was the number we announced as part of the new local plan system announcement last week. But funding and support to help you get there is absolutely will be available. But come to us with any specific problems. But I think we have to, and it won't, it may be messy in certain parts of the country in terms of how we get there. But I think we've got to proceed on the basis of taking all these things forward at once with all the challenges that entails, which I completely understand.
And finally, what will success look like for you in 2029?
Success. Well, I think when I look back, and I think this is what's it worth saying? It's worth saying I spent a lot of time in opposition putting together, to the best of my ability and to the best of the party's ability, a comprehensive plan to address the housing crisis in this country. We are, as I said again at this conference last week, with some minor additions, variations, we're faithfully executing that plan almost to the letter. Success in that world, and this is where I think there is a bit of a quid pro quo with the industry, if we're reducing development costs, if we're streamlining the system, if we manage to do what we say on that front, we do need to see a corresponding uptick in supply. And that's where, and I suppose coming back to Jenny's point in the SMEs, we need the volumes, Goon Taylor Wimpey, to be doing what they do best and more of it. We need other players on the pitch to ensure we've got that diversity of supply and that there is more competition on quality and volume to drive those numbers. Success for me means a very, very steep curve up to that 1.5 million target in the last year of the Parliament.
Minister. Please put your hands together.